Welcome back. All right, so I want to talk about the original Ottawa Senators, not the current Ottawa Senators who debuted in the NHL in 1992, 1993, but the originals. The ones that, yes, they won Stanley Cups. The number of Stanley Cups is debatable, and I say debatable because the format they had at the time, anyways, but we'll talk about that. The Ottawa Senators, the original incarnation of this team, founded in 1883, didn't always go by the name Ottawa Senators. Changed names various times. Same with the Toronto Maple Leafs, who were the Arenas. They were the St. Patrick's, became the Maple Leafs, but it's the same team. And in fact, with Toronto, they've been the Blue Shirts before that, but that's a whole other debate. Anyways, so the Ottawa Senators, founded in 1883 at a time where hockey rinks, there weren't very many. They were one of the earliest teams. Line changes, they didn't have lines. You had 6 players. You had 7 players, but you didn't have 23 players. You didn't have huge rosters, right? Now, they wore red and black right from the start. And the barber pole look they had, they kept through most of their existence, although when they were up against a similar looking barber pole jersey slash sweater from the Seattle Metropolitans, they wore white jerseys that had the O in the middle. So you could tell the difference between the two because otherwise they looked virtually identical. So they were also part of the Amateur Hockey Association of Canada, founded in 1886. So, of course, right away you understand that if you're going to make this work, you have to form a league. And there were various leagues that would form over the years before the National Hockey League came in and really took the whole world by storm. But this was a team in Ottawa that actually was dormant for 2 years. Yep, 1888, 1889, due to a lack of ice rinks. So the ice rink they'd been using was converted to a roller skating rink. Just imagine that. The Ottawa Senators, come out and they go, so we really thought, this was going to work, but it turns out that we're gonna make Scotiabank Arena. It's going to be a roller rink this year, so we have nowhere to play. We're just going to suspend operations. Might happen next year as well. These things happen. We'll be back. Just I can't imagine. Now, eventually they do return and they become a really well-run team. The Ottawa Silver Sevens end up winning a Stanley Cup in 1903, 1904, and 1905 during the Challenge era. The Challenge era was great. The Challenge era, sometimes it's a single game series between a team from one league and a team from another. Sometimes best of three. 2-game total goals was also a way to decide. And in 1914, at the end of the Challenge era, before we start seeing a better way of figuring this out, it was a best of 5. And then it remained a challenge, but it was between your NHA winner, then NHL winner, and the winner on the West Coast as well. So the Ottawa Hockey Club are considered runners-up in 1910 as part of the NHA. But when I look at my jersey here, it's got 1910. What gives? Well, there's some debate about whether or not that 1910 Stanley Cup is recognized as Ottawa's or not. They technically did win and hold up a trophy, which was much smaller than the trophy they have now. It's really just the bowl at the top. But, I mean, they technically aren't the final winner. And so we'll talk about that again as we go through here. Shadow crashed into the board, or Bear did. 1910, 1911, the NHA introduces a salary cap, and Ottawa players are not happy about it. So they threaten to form their own league, but instead they begrudgingly decide to play because there are no arenas for them to create a new league around. The arenas that are in place are, controlled by the guys who own the NHA teams. So what are they going to do? There aren't multiple arenas in a city. So instead they played and they won the cup. So the best way to get over it is fine, we'll just win the Stanley Cup. Now, in terms of Stanley Cup wins between the NHL and the PCHA, which became the WHL, 1920, 1921, and 1923 they win. So the math tells you that's 3 cups in 4 years. That is the first official dynasty in the National Hockey League. And so that's the measure. 3 Stanley Cups in 4 years, and we have the debate about what should be considered a modern dynasty, but technically a dynasty is 3 cups in 4 years. So in 1920, they win that Stanley Cup final against Seattle, who were coming out of the PCHA to challenge for the cup. And that was the Metropolitans' final Stanley Cup appearance. So if we ever get Ottawa versus Seattle in the Stanley Cup, that's a throwback to more than a century ago. And of course, Ottawa and Seattle fans would be very excited. Ottawa fans would be just beside themselves because it feels like it's been forever since they were in the playoffs. But yeah, 1920 Stanley Cup final. That's where the Ottawa Senators say, okay, our jerseys look the same as theirs. I know it's sweaters. I know. But we look the same as theirs. We've got to change it, and they get the white shirts with the O in the middle, which of course is still considered to be, their logo from that era. Other than that, I don't think they had one. So after the challenge era is done, they win one Stanley Cup, 1927. They won the series 2-0 against the Boston Bruins. So just best 2 out of 3. And they were called the Super Six. That's what that team was called that year. That was considered to be a great team. But then things fell off. And financially, this was a team that was having trouble as well. But I want to come back to this jersey here. So again, it's got there's 1906, there's 1910. So 1906 and 1910, they won Stanley Cup challenges to hold up the cup, but they were not champs at the end of it. So that final cup challenge, they didn't win. So the debate over whether or not Ottawa's the Stanley Cup champions, up for debate, right? Can you imagine? We just saw Vegas a month ago hold up the Stanley Cup. Can you imagine if in a couple of weeks they play against the Hershey Bears beat them, and then it's, well, actually, Hershey's the Stanley Cup champs. So, yeah, and you have the big parade, and then a couple months later, actually, we just lost the Stanley Cup, so you guys are going to have to take it off that tour and give it to that team. Now they get to go on a tour with it. And again, I had to put that there, but the 100th anniversary jersey, and that's why I'm wearing this, because it's right there. 1906, 1910, officially recognized as Stanley Cup wins. Now, the interesting thing is, going back to the 1927 Stanley Cup, the team lost money. They lost $50,000. By today's standards, the team's saying we lost 50 grand this year. Not a big deal. But back then, it's, I don't know, roughly $5, $6, $7, $8 billion. I'm kidding, obviously, but this is a team that can't afford to lose money. The city of Ottawa is by far the smallest market, 110,000 people, a fifth of the size of Toronto, and Toronto is the second smallest market in the National Hockey League at that point. Yeah, things were quite different back then. So this was a team that was struggling to generate money. So prior to the 1930-31 season, the team sold players just to make sure that they were financially viable. Again, if you did that in today's game, if that was allowed in today's game, fans would go completely crazy. So this is an Ottawa team that's struggling financially, and the NHL has a lot of teams struggling financially. If you look back at the 1920s through the Depression, especially post-World War I, the fact that the NHL got through this and survived is nothing short of miraculous. So the Ottawa Senators go on hiatus for the 1931-32 season. They can't afford it. So they go on hiatus, and the National Hockey League allows them to do that for a year, but that year off, it doesn't help. The team actually moves to St. Louis in 1934 and becomes the St. Louis Eagles. The St. Louis Eagles play 1 year, and then they go to the NHL and say, look, we're not making any money. Travel costs are through the roof. So they lost like 70 grand that year, and a lot of that's because of travel. St. Louis is nowhere near the other franchises in New York and Montreal and Boston and Chicago and Detroit. So they want to go on hiatus, and the NHL says no. The St. Louis Eagles looked for ownership, like they tried to sell the team. There were no reasonable bids for that team, and so the team folded. The St. Louis Eagles folded. So the Ottawa Senators, as it were, moved and folded in 1935. Fans in Ottawa, and I thought this was interesting, I'm going to put this on the board, used to throw lemons at opposing teams. So Cyclone Taylor, after he had left the Ottawa Senators in his return to Ottawa, apparently he got a lot of lemons thrown at him. Interesting decision. As it was mentioned too, the ice surface used to not have boards between the players and the fans. There wasn't a partition there. That's dangerous. So just imagine fans throwing something at a player, and the player seeing the fan that threw something at him, and there not being boards or glass in the way. You might not see fans throwing things at players. That might put an end to it. You wouldn't need to climb over the glass. You can just right there, section 113, row 14, seat 7, right there. Right? Yeah, I think that's Bill. hey, Bill, we're coming for you. So, yeah, just the idea that fans would have something like a fruit that they go, as a fan base, we should throw this fruit at this player. It's crazy. The number one franchise leader in points was Cy Denny. I believe he's in the Hall of Fame. There are a number of players from that Ottawa era that are in the Hall of Fame. 302 games played, 245 goals, 67 assists, 312 points. During that era, assists weren't always counted, and single assists were sometimes counted as well. So the fact that he only has 67 assists doesn't really surprise me. It was a completely different era. I know that people will still say, well, technically Ottawa wins that. As a city, yes. As a city, they've won those Stanley Cups. They want to have banners up for that, absolutely. But this Ottawa Senators team that currently exists in the National Hockey League does not have that. So I don't have a problem with them having a jersey that comes out that has Stanley Cups on it. That, again, there's a debate about whether or not were their Stanley Cups in the end. It doesn't bother me, though, because it is part of the city's history, but it is not part of this current Ottawa Senators history. As I've mentioned a couple times lately, Vancouver, if they change the name to Millionaires, it doesn't mean that they can suddenly say, hey, we have a Stanley Cup banner we're going to put up. There would rightfully be a lot of laughing and finger pointing, probably some of it from this guy. But there you go. So for anybody who didn't know about the Ottawa Senators' original history, there it is. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.